El Collapso, the Black Death, did not only kill people. It killed systems. To understand what the plague destroyed, you have to understand what medieval European society was. The feudal system, which had governed Europe for 500 years, was built on a simple logic. Land was the only real wealth. Peasants worked that land in exchange for protection. They could not leave. They could not marry without permission. It required a surplus of labor to function. When 1/3 of Europe's population died in 5 years, that surplus disappeared overnight. For the first time in 500 years, labor was scarce, and the peasants who survived began to realize they could ask for more. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, attempting to freeze wages. It failed, almost entirely. Wages rose, peasants moved. The peasants' revolts that followed, England in 1381, France in 1358, were directly connected to this new leverage. They were crushed, brutally, but the underlying economics did not change. The feudal system had been fatally wounded. The church suffered equally. It owned perhaps 1/3 of the land in Europe. It ran the universities. It told people why they were alive. Then the priests died alongside the sinners. The church lost, by some estimates, half its clergy. If God's prayers could not protect the faithful, what did that mean? These questions did not disappear. 150 years later, in 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to a church door and began the Protestant Reformation. The Black Death did not cause the Reformation, but it dug the ground. The survivors, we talk about the Black Death in numbers. 25 million dead, 1/3 of Europe. But behind every number, there was a person. A mother in Bristol who watched her husband die on a Thursday, her son on a Saturday, who survived, who had to decide what to do with everything that remained. A young priest in Normandy who buried his entire parish and then sat alone, trying to understand why he was still alive. The first thing survivors faced was disruption never seen before. When half the craftsmen in a city die, who makes the shoes? Who bakes the bread? At the same time, and this is the paradox, survivors were often better off than they had ever been. When 1/3 of people die, the remaining 2/3 inherit their possessions: land, tools, houses. For the peasant who survived and whose lord had died, there was for the first time a possibility of ownership. In Florence, which had lost perhaps half its population, surviving families found themselves with extraordinary inherited wealth, the Medici, the Strozzi, and they began to spend it on something new. On beauty, on philosophy, on paintings that showed the human body as it actually was. The Renaissance, the word means rebirth, was not caused by one thing. But among its causes was the enormous wealth redistribution from the plague, and the profound human need to insist on the value of life after watching so much of it end. The survivors of the Black Death, or their children, created the Renaissance. Out of the worst catastrophe in European history, a rebirth. The legacy. We are the children of the Black Death. Not metaphorically, historically, biologically. Let us trace the line. The Black Death breaks feudalism. Labor begins to be compensated rather than conscripted. This is the foundation of every wage, every worker's right, every negotiation between employer and employee that has ever existed. The Black Death breaks the church's monopoly on truth. When the institution that speaks for God cannot explain why God is killing his own creation, People look elsewhere for answers. A century later, scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople bring ancient Greek manuscripts to Florence, a city full of plague-generated wealth and plague-generated hunger for new understanding. The Renaissance follows. The scientific revolution follows. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton. The Black Death invents public health. The quarantine system developed in Venice in 1377 is the direct ancestor of the World Health Organization, the CDC, every contact tracing system that exists today. When COVID-19 spread across the world in 2020, the tools used to fight it were the same tools developed in the plague years: quarantine, isolation. 650 years later, the same lesson still being learned. And the Black Death changes how we think about human life itself. Before the plague, this life was merely a passage to eternity. After watching bodies pile up without regard for virtue or prayer, something shifted. The idea that each individual life has value and deserves to be understood on its own terms is a Renaissance idea. And the Renaissance is, in part, a response to the plague. The rats that left those ships in Messina in October 1347 did not know what they were doing. But what they left behind, after the dying stopped, was a world cracked open. A world where the poor had discovered their power, where the church had been forced to share its authority, where ancient wisdom was being read again by firelight. A world becoming, against all odds, something new. The Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe. The world that was born from those deaths is the world we live in. We should know this story. We should know who we are. In October 1347, 12 ships docked in the harbor at Messina. The world that walked down to meet them on the dock that morning was the last day of one age. And the first day of ours.